Well, good morning. It's great to see you all here. I'm Ron Hannaford. I work as the Director of Distance Learning at Biola here at university, and I've previously served at Fuller Seminary. I was in charge of their distance education program for 7 years and helped grow that. And as you can tell, I have a southern accent from deep south. Any further south I'd be a penguin and that sort of thing. But I've been here, I came for 2 years to America to do some study. I've been here almost 15 and they won't seem to let me go. But my family, my wife and I are here, but my family have all returned to Australia. So we tend to go back and try and connect at least once a year if we can. What I want to share this morning is really a little bit of an offshoot of what I did from a PhD research. I was developing a model of online education that's for holistic student formation, appropriate for global cross-cultural contexts. And what I was looking at is relationships and authentic relationships and how they need to be formed so that they can to bring that development for students, but also for spiritual formation pieces. And I developed out a whole range of things to do with researching monastical practices from the 3rd and 4th centuries and how we could do things like that in an online context. However, what I did also find was that the desire for connection within society, which is, I think, driving what social media is used for. People want to be connected, they want to be heard, is what I sort of saw this and thought, well, now how do we address that so that we don't reinforce that sense of isolation or loneliness in a distance program, or even on campus, as people come from all over the place. So how do we do that? And so some of the things that I was researching was showing how there's different meanings in what's happening. There's different contexts behind why we're doing social media. So I want to touch on 3 basic areas of that this morning and just hopefully walk you through those sorts of things. So we're going to be looking at how this learning in social media pertains to holistic human development. And then the impact of social media, and particularly online social networks with regard to self-disclosure, which is very difficult in a public forum, isn't it? And then people can be connected, but alone, isonection, so to speak. So what do these things, how do these things relate to educational practices on campus, off campus, and all those sorts of areas? So we're going to try and touch on a few of those things. So it's a little bit different to if you were here with joining us with Rebecca's presentation earlier. She did a marvellous job of, how to engage students and help them to begin to feel connected in first year or freshman situation coming to college, and that was really a wonderful project, which I'm sure is going to produce great fruit. But I'm going to take it in slightly different areas, as you see, according to this. Now, there's one little thing I'd like to just firstly go to, which is just an interesting fact. After this slide, I just realised it was the wrong slide. With the exponential increase, we obviously have benefits, but there are limitations. And there will be a number of things we need to be aware of as we start to think about using these mediums in education. So this is interesting. The average attention span in 2012 is 8 seconds for internet use and attention span. The average attention span in 2000 was 12 seconds. And the average attention span of a goldfish is only 9 seconds. So, obviously we're getting very, very quick, going here, going there. We're following a lot of things. Things are very difficult. So to try and get meaningful connection, meaningful engagement, when it's so quickly fast-paced, is a question we have to look at. And then the average length watched of a single internet video is 2.7 minutes. So it sort of hits at the issue of trying to present a whole lecture of 45 minutes or an hour of a faculty member going on in an online class, or even a flipped class in education, because their attention span, unless you're very, very good, would not be necessarily held. So these provide challenges, partly because it's inground in the culture now. We're beginning to be more and more connected, short attention span and all those sorts of things happening. So, but there are benefits. There are benefits with regard to use of social media. And UCLA have shown that in their study of brain research, that the naive, those who don't use it or haven't used it much before, had very little brain stimulation. But the savvy ones, even with older people, had quite an interesting brain stimulation. And they did scan in one session and then the second. But they've particularly found that this is really interesting for helping older people in their aging to stimulate their brain. It's really an active piece. Can be utilised in a very intentional way, which is really good. So we have this scenario, and so we think, oh, well, that's great, we should get everyone involved in social media. Well, let's have a little look at something else. There's another guy from UCLA who has done a lot of stuff, particularly with neurobiology. He's actually an MD, but he studied things on child, adolescent and adult psychiatry, particularly with regard to attachment, emotions and behaviour and memory. And what he talks about, I'm going to show his very short clip, a piece of what he talks about in a moment. What he talks about is that this does stimulate brain. But from his perspective, when we're looking at development of children, when we're looking at development of young people or people generally, there needs to be a balanced approach to how we use this, because otherwise we will be developing only one section of the brain. So let's have a little look at this out of interest. I hope that the audio plays. I'm just waiting to see how we go with this.
Wise-minded parent, you will find great opportunities to explore how you can use fundamental strategies to increase your child's ability to understand their emotions. In the field I work in interpersonal neurobiology, what we've done is try to bring all the sciences together to understand our human development, our human experience, and in fact, to approach what the mind is. Now, in doing that in a way that's useful for parents, what we find is that you can actually think of the brain as kind of like a system in the body that works somewhat similar to a muscle in that when you exercise it, you get it stronger. And there are certain circuits in the brain that allow you to calm yourself down, to understand yourself, to understand others. Now, I call those mind-sight circuits. Mind-sight is the ability to see, that's the sight part. The mind, that's the internal sense we have of what you're aware of, your feelings, your thoughts, your memories, things like that. So parents have an opportunity in lots of ways, using their communication to develop these mind-sight circuits, like exercising the muscle of the mind-sight capacity. Now, how do you do that? Reflective conversations are conversations we often have face-to-face, where you, if you were my child, would see my facial response to you. We'd have eye contact. You'd hear the tone of my voice. You'd see my posture. You'd sense my gestures and the timing and intensity of my response. Now, all of those, including touch, are nonverbal signals that we can use to communicate with each other. In the digital age, many children, adolescents, and even adults are having a lot of time being stimulated by the infinite amount of flowing information that comes from the internet, from games, from blogs, from websites, all sorts of ways in which visual and auditory stimuli are pulling us toward that. So because the brain is kind of like a muscle, it gets entrained to get really excited by shifting visual and auditory stimuli. What does that mean for the ability to have mind sight, which many people believe is the basis of emotional intelligence and social intelligence? Well, my concern is that when we don't have face-to-face time, when we aren't having eye contact, when we aren't using tone of voice and posture and gestures and timing, intensity of response to connect with each other, we're actually not using this basic vocabulary that allows the inside to be expressed outwardly. And instead of using these fundamental mind-sight circuits that allow us to have emotional and social intelligence, we're really building up another set of circuits that allows us to be drawn to the physical world, to perceptions of all this stimuli that the internet is dominant in. Now, it doesn't mean that the internet is bad. It just means that, number one, if you're involved in creating things on the internet, let's make them more social and emotional. And number two, it means if you're a parent, you need to make sure that your child is balancing different kinds of experiences. So you don't just have them hop on their left leg and their right leg deteriorates. You want them to use both legs so that they can walk beautifully through life. The same is true with the physical stimuli we get from the internet and with face-to-face time that allows these mind-sight circuits to develop. Anything that allows you to reflect on the inner nature of our lives in the self and in others will allow us to build emotional skills, social skills, and these are in fact the basis of resilience.
So there's a challenge there, isn't there, for us as educators to think, well, it's not just technology. We just don't grab technology and do it and it's going to stimulate all this brain function and stuff. There needs to be a balanced approach. So we still have, engagement in various ways. Now that's very difficult for me as a distance education person looking at online study. Now I personally don't particularly like 100% online programs, but I do like those that are what we call blended online programs. So you have a series of classes and you have a face-to-face seminar at one point and then maybe later on you have another one where there can be this sort of engagement and relationship established, and it can help foster this aspect in the people's development. Now there's one other thing that follows on with this is further cognitive research, particularly this Michelle Miller from northern Arizona. She presented a session at Sloan last year, and she did a lot of research on this, but she said that with regard to cognitive aspects of the brain, in other words, being able to remember things, short-term, long-term, and then through repetitive things, what's the key thing to retention? And she basically said was attention is key to retention. So in other words, when we get a whole lot of other stuff, we get effort and practice, and we have a whole range of issues where we focus on things. We might have repetition in learning, we have a whole range of things like that. But it's that which we're focused on is what we retain. And she said that, it's just like, how many remember driving here this morning and exactly what they did on the road, where they braked exactly, and whatever you did. You don't remember those things because your brain just does it automatically. And so the same sorts of thing happens when with so many things coming at us, our brain filters out the information we get. So when we get massively inundated with social media, we sort of try to find a way through it, our brain filters it out, and we sort of hang on to something that's appropriate, we think, for us. And then some of the things we actually remember, and others we don't. And so this was really the main thing. We only really have memory. If we want to have a learning that's going to last, memory, it's that which is when people are focused upon or attention to a particular issue. So that then raises a question for us, and I want to see us break into little groups here in a moment and ask these questions, because what does this mean for us as educators from this perspective. We can have mobile devices in class, we can have mobile devices in use in various ways, and that's great for interaction, support, feedback, surveys, all sorts of things. But what's it mean when people are doing social networking in a class instead of listening to your lecture and they say, oh, well, I'm multitasking. But the research shows from these people, multitasking you don't remember. You know about it, but you don't remember. If you want long-term memory, it needs to be focused attention. So what does that mean for us as educators? So here's a couple of questions. Maybe break into a few groups of 3 or 4 and get around and just begin to discuss some of these things. Have anyone thought about this sort of stuff? You know, holistic development of the brain, of the mind, and then building on memory issues. Have you been thinking about that? Have you done anything with this on your campus? What would it mean for you if you were to integrate more social media into your classes? Just go for it. So that's great discussion. So this is the beginning. Okay, this is one piece. So we need to think about holistic brain and relational and emotional development. That professor from UCLA with his brain video was talking about even little children. You know, they're getting in. Kids are doing stuff from a young age these days. They've still got to be having that personal interaction for holistic development. Okay, so let's move along. This is a bit of a complicated slide, and I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but this is research from the Pew Research study. It was published in 2011, and it was done in 2010, and they were trying to assess internet access and relational connectedness between the differences between 2008 and 2010, so over a 2-year period. But generally what they said was that social network users had more friends and more close friends than they did 2 years before. So they're saying that this is obviously a momentum, there's things happening here, there's a connection happening. Average American in this sort of setup had 634 social ties, but tech users tended to have bigger networks, which was an interesting finding. But the average non-internet user has only 506 social ties. So it's obviously, by exposure, it's happening. The frequent internet user, you know, they're using it really often, like these tweeting type people, they have 732, and those that only use it 1 or 2 times a day only have 616. So how they get all these figures, I don't know. But it's I'm glad I'm not doing it. But average cell phone user has 664. With internet access, a smartphone, he actually has, or she has, 717. And then it goes down. But look, basically, this is interesting. 5% report having no discussion confidence. Even though all this stuff is out there, although they're seemingly more connected than we ever have been, still 5% of how many millions in this country? That's a lot of people have nobody to talk to about their personal problems, and you can't do that in a public sphere. It's very difficult to deal with your issues. But they still have an average of 2.45 close ties. Now, those who go to a 4-year school, 4-year undergraduate uni degree, have 12% more close ties than high schoolers. I'm not sure whether that's because they did your Twitter class. Maybe they felt more connected after. Maybe they researched your class. But it's interesting, isn't it, that that's the way it goes. Now, when it comes to social media users, they have more diverse friends. Well, that's great, and so they should. They're more exposed, they're out there, they're going beyond their local community in their town or city, wherever they've been, where they've grown up, and they have a greater diversity. But Facebook actually had 39 on the diversity scale. Twitter had 42, so it was actually higher. But the non-internet users only had 38. Now, I don't know how they did that scale. I'm just quoting the figures here. But I'm just trying to help us get a perspective of diversity, engagement, how this is working with regard to social ties, and then we're going to look in a moment at what this might mean. But the interesting thing too here is for every year of education, formal education is equivalent to 1.5 extra points in the diversity scale. So internet users, the difference between here, internet users 43 and non-users 38, internet users have a boost in diversity that's equivalent to 2 years of formal education. It's a strange thing to think about, but here we go. So there's this boost in diversity, which is similar to the sort of thing that happens with education that actually happens through social media. Now, the interesting thing they came down to here, Pew said, the total network size may not be as important as other factors, such as intimacy. It's very difficult to have intimacy. You might have all these social ties, but do you have an authentic relationship with people? Now, they said that these things were important, but most of those who used Facebook had the best relationships with those face-to-face as well as online, which follows up the brain research stuff we had, talking about balanced things. Emotionally, relationally, if people can connect personally with their Facebook friends, they are more connected, more engaged. And so that's interesting. Now, when it comes to other research, Ledbetter in 2011 and the colleagues there, Ledbetter actually was, there's 3 faculty members got together and wrote this research paper. But they were looking at online social connection as a relationship to online self-disclosure. Now, is that almost an oxymoron? It proved to be that. They found that the more people self-disclosed, the less connected they were relationally. It's almost like, I think people, I don't want to know your problem. I don't want to know that. But if they kept a face and kept a front and monitored their profile and looked sweet and clean and didn't disclose too much, they had a lot of connections. It's funny, isn't it? It's really strange. So, but what this study was looking at was the aspect of closeness as a subjective experience involving intimacy. And so this whole checking out, how close are these connections? Like we looked at that stuff for Pew, that was be my question that comes. How close are these connections? They say we're more connected, but are we really more connected as we want humanly to be? This is an interesting quote. It was part of this study. It says, we would expect people who are lonely or are socially anxious in traditional face-to-face interaction settings to be likely to feel better able to express their true self over the internet. In other words, they have poor communication skills face-to-face. And they said that was actually the case. So what you were saying earlier, Rebecca, about that very quiet, reserved student who couldn't hardly even communicate, but got on Twitter and was flying off and going everywhere, actually was quite true. That sort of thing does work. And particularly even for some cultural groups that find it difficult to talk face-to-face with a professor or in a class setting, they will find it easier online to involved with a discussion board and be involved in Twitter and other things because they're not facing you personally face-to-face. So the issue of culture, the guys up here are talking about culture and how that works, is a major factor that comes to play in some of these things as well, communication issues. So, this aspect here, as I said, maintaining your identity, watching over your profile. We heard it last night, didn't we? Matthew talking about how we make sure we manage this and we do that and we present ourselves well and we don't let anybody see the real us because that's not going to sell you very well. What we're doing is actually setting up an avatar. We are presenting an image of something we're not fully. We're somebody different. Now that's good for promotion and that sort of stuff. That's great. But it actually has some implications. We're going to be discussing those things shortly. But those who are socially anxious can prefer online communication, this is what this found in this study, online communication that is, they don't want to be involved in that high warrant information. Now, what high warrant is you know, Facebook says, righto, let's, I like you, and I like this photograph, and you look great today, and, you know, fantastic stuff. You get all these comments coming you can't control. That's called high warrant information, and Facebook is set up for that. But those who are socially inept or very much more open to social disclosure online want to have control over what's disclosed and how they're presented. So they'll tend to go for low warrant websites that do that. They can control it more, whereas Facebook they can't control. So it's a very interesting finding that relates to online self-disclosure, but yet also image maintenance, and all this stuff is very complicated. But because that's what we are as people, isn't it? It's a little bit complicated, but it has interesting ramifications. So online social disclosure is inversely predicted relational closeness. That's what I was relating to before, that those who disclose more actually have less connections. There's research was showing that. But they found, like the other guys, that relational solidarity happens offline and online. So there's this balance thing. Like the brain guys, like the previous thing in Pew. Now we're finding these guys are saying the same thing. So, it's possible that other forces foster a positive attitude toward online social disclosure, such as a desire to create a sense of relational immediacy, like teachers. Now, in our classes, we want to have engagement, we want to have that social immediacy, we want to have the sort of engagement and using these tools. And so that can foster a positive attitude towards social disclosure, but it's still only going to be limited because it's out there publicly. So we just need to be aware. Some of these things have forces. We're using, we're trying to come and utilise things, but then there's things working against us in being open and honest in that forum because it's more public. Those sorts of things. But there's this social immediacy thing which we can actually ask to happen in our design of classes and what we do with education, but it may not necessarily happen so easily. So the conclusions out of Ledbetter's research is that online social communication is a healthy, communicatively competent motivation for using online communication. But motivation arising from social disclosure is associated with negative relational outcomes. Not only negative psychosocial outcomes, but negative relational outcomes. We tend not to think about this sort of thing, but it's starting to be found in this research now that's quite fascinating. But I think this is where we find, when we talk about connection in social media in a public sphere, Facebook and others are doing the bridging, not necessarily deep bonding. This is one of the things that they found as their thing, that social networking sites, Facebook and that, communication better supports and facilitates bridging of social capital, not necessarily bonding in social capital. That's a very important distinction. So, who else has spoken about this? Well, Dana Boyd, she works for Microsoft. And what do you think? Well, now, what would they want? They would just want to promote social media and get it all out there and make it happen. Well, I was at a session she presented in 2011, and she was talking about privacy in the era of social media, and she was saying about how social steganography is taking over. Now, steganography, for those of you like me who didn't know what that was about, is actually to do with the sort of thing they were doing in the Second World War, where the guys would do their little code, Morse code, and they were saying one thing, but actually the interpreters knew what they were saying something else. And you know, that sort of thing. So this is what's happening. They're saying in Facebook and other things, particularly where family are involved, and the students are saying, well, I don't want my mum or my dad or my uncles and aunts and whoever else is my friend on Facebook to know what I'm really talking about. I want to talk to my friends and I want to communicate how I really feel. So I will express it this way. So they're developing language that's saying one thing that's actually meaning another. So there's content without meaning. And it's to filter out the exposure publicly that they're feeling from their parents and others, teachers, faculty, in that sense. And so this is actually still, again, back to really wanting to manage their profile, not appear to be vulnerable or badly doing something publicly they shouldn't be known to be doing. And so they actually limit what they do and how they do it. So I thought that was a fascinating study, and she actually gave many examples of students that she'd interviewed and talked about how they managed to do this. So in our second discussion, let's have a breakout now and think about this. Social media encourages image manipulation for self-protection and preservation. And obviously we don't want to be exposed, like so many people, famous people, have put things out there and boom, it's hit the fan, and you know they lost their career or lost their job or something's happened. And students are vulnerable too. But what are the implications for students and educators as we seek authentic Christian learning and development? Can we successfully encourage appropriate openness on a personal level amongst peers when they've been developing and being trained in image protection, which shrouds them off and it doesn't really help them engage? They hold it back. When we get into a classroom or online classes, how can we help them move to that vulnerable place of sharing something that can be meaningful and engaging for transforming of them? So that's an interesting question. And then how can we do spiritual formation amongst peers if that sort of thing's working? That's the pressure, isn't it? Break into your groups, have another discussion. See what you think about this. You know, is manipulation of our image something that's really detrimental, or is it, obviously it's protection. Have a talk about it from an education perspective. What do you think this might mean? Because these are the social influences we're facing. And we're now walking within this. How do we do this in education? What do we do? Now, this is a launching pad for the next piece of some of the research. Cassioppo from University of Chicago is a psychologist and research psychologist. And he was been really looking at the use of social media and loneliness and the issues we just talked about of protection. And yet we talked about connection, having all those connections, but is there authenticity? Is there a real need being met in the person in this sort of stuff? So this was a very interesting thing that perceived, not actual, but perceived social isolation, that is loneliness, is more important predictor of a variety of adverse health outcomes than objective social isolation. Now his research goes into some really interesting stuff. He says there's physical manifestations because of loneliness. There's emotional manifestations. There's all this sort of stuff. And so to some extent the social media movement has gained this impetus, particularly in the Western individualised society, because we want to feel connected. We want to be heard. Somebody's listening. Somebody's following us on Twitter. There's a sense of need within ourselves as people. And yet the very thing we're looking for is probably, because of this protection now, publicly, is the very thing we won't find, except we find it in a very few close confidence. And so this is a challenge for us when we're trying to help people deal with loneliness, because it's a massive problem in the society. Loneliness is a major problem. In fact, it's about 75% of the pastors leave ministry because loneliness has been one of the major factors. I've got research on that stuff, yes?
I don't understand the difference that you're saying here between perceived. What's the difference between perceived and objective social isolation?
People looking at and thinking, well, they're socially isolated. But this is somebody outside objectively assessing this person's an isolated person. whereas the person who perceives, they feel, they sense, they think that they're isolated, and so therefore they're responding out of that need.
Okay.
So it's a perceived thing for that person themselves. Sorry, thanks for clarifying. I should have clarified that more. Staying connected is the response to social pain we call loneliness, which is the very thing we see as what's prompting a lot of the stuff. And research over 20 years, he says, has shown there's directly links between well-being and social and cultural and social acceptance directly related to perceived loneliness. So this, again, and this guy's done this research reference to social media, reference to the internet use, reference to this stuff. So it's not as if they're not connected. They're connected, because we heard from the Pew Research stuff before. There's more connections for those that have got it than those who don't use the internet. But the issue is real connection, socially, relationally, emotionally connected. Intimacy is what we need to help students to find, which is where it comes back to this area of honesty. Because we can't have spiritual development, we can't have spiritual or holistically developed students if they're not prepared to be relationally vulnerable. See, I don't know how many of you have thought about groups, but if you're in a group learning discussion forum, if you're building a cohort learning group that goes through study together and you really want them to have very authentic spiritual formation experience, that cannot happen without real honesty. But for that real honesty to happen, there's actually a paradox. There's several paradoxes in groups. One is, and I'll give an example, just one, that if I wanted to be close to Janice, I could begin to share vulnerably with Janice, but with the possibility she might reject me. So I'm laying myself out there to be accepted, but with the actual possibility of being rejected. So there's the acceptance for rejection, or there's possibility of being rejected while I'm wanting the acceptance. So there's this paradox in establishing a group. And that changes too with regard to cultures, as we brought up cultures before. You know, different cultures are happy to divulge personal information more than others. And so there's these other factors that come to play in relationships and in engagement in an honest way in this sort of thing. So, but loneliness, the important point they make is loneliness is not the same as being alone. Being alone is like going to the beach, having some sun, you know, go enjoying yourself, getting out some peace and quiet, refreshing the soul. It's beautiful. But it doesn't mean you're a lonely person. So we just need to be able to understand those sorts of differences. So this is where Cassiapo, this is the three people, they wrote this particular article in 2009, Alone in the Crowd. This is, again, particularly related to social media and internet. But University of Chicago, University of San Diego, and Harvard, this is the guys that wrote it. There's a discrepancy between an individual's loneliness and the number of connections in a social network. And it's well documented. And it ends up quite often in what they call isonection. Well, they don't actually call it that. But that's effectively what they're talking about. They're connected, but they're isolated. People on the periphery, in a social sense, in an individualistic society like we have, need help to establish meaningful social, deep relationship connections. And that's what our task is. And we can't begin to do that if we don't understand the context, we don't understand what's going on. We need to be abreast of all this sort of stuff to say, actually, we need to help our students develop in this way. Tony Beliz from Los Angeles County Mental Health section, he spoke at a conference my wife went to, and he said, look, so many of the young people in juvenile detention centres and even in jail have actually got really good social networks on Facebook and other places, but they're very lonely. They're absolute loners. And he said it's a major problem, practically on the ground in LA right now. So, you know, emotionally and physically isolated, but yet they're connected via the internet. And he said, sorry, yes?
Did you start that by saying that they have good networks on Facebook?
They have, yeah.
So
They've got.
how do we qualify that as a good network?
Well, they're active in that medium.
You just mean that's a wide
Yeah.
network?
Yeah. I don't know how, he didn't actually, I don't know that he's done research on how connected they are, but they're active in that medium. So they're using social media.
They have a
large number of connections in that sense, but there's this lack of reality in real life with their community or with their needs immediately to them. So it's a bit of a challenge. And he said that so many teachers, you know, and this is where your teachers, your training, going into the public schools, going into elementary schools, all that sort of stuff, will face students who have issues like this. They will face this. And they need to be guided in how to address some of this, because it's the personal need of every person for holistic relationship and development. And we need to be just aware, just to think through how we're going to help our teachers and even our students themselves come through these sorts of things. Here's an interesting tweet. Isolation. Emotional, physical isolation while feeling connected through social media that never provides a real relationship, that person said. One last video. I'm going to give you a very short clip. This is Sherry Turkle from MIT. She's a college professor of social studies and science related to technology. And she really is actually saying if we allow just the technology to rule our lives and be so immersed in it, if our kids just live in the machine, they're giving up conversation for connection. They're looking for identity, they're looking for relationship, they're looking for some sense of purpose in a machine instead of in relationships and people. And she spoke on a TED Talk, which I'm going to give you a very short clip out of this. By the way, all of this presentation is going to be downloadable. I'll give you a link to it, and it's got all the references in the notes section. So all the references to anything I've spoken about is all inserted. But she says we need the time to reflect. We need the time to engage with people. As we reflect and process, then we can know how we fit in the thing. So it's just speaking to the whole isolation issue. And let's see how we go. But this is important. She says still people need to know somebody's listening. And in relationship, personally, face to face, somebody needs to be listening. Okay, let's have a little look at this. And
I was caught off guard when Stephen Colbert asked me a profound question. A profound question. He said, don't all those little tweets, don't all those little sips of online communication add up to one big gulp of real conversation? My answer was no, they don't add up. Connecting in sips may work for gathering discrete bits of information. They may work for saying I'm thinking about you, or even for saying I love you. I mean, look at how I felt when I got that text from my daughter. But they don't really work for learning about each other, for really coming to know and understand each other. And we use conversations with each other to learn how to have conversations with ourselves. So a flight from conversation can really matter because it can compromise our capacity for self-reflection. For kids growing up, that skill is the bedrock of development. Over and over I hear, I would rather text than talk. And what I'm seeing is that people get so used to being shortchanged out of real conversation, so used to getting by with less, that they become almost willing to dispense with people altogether. So, for example, many people share with me this wish that someday a more advanced version of Siri, the digital assistant on Apple's iPhone, will be more like a best friend, someone who will listen when others won't. I believe this wish reflects a painful truth that I've learned in the past 15 years. That feeling that no one is listening to me is very important in our relationships with technology. That's why it's so appealing to have a Facebook page or a Twitter feed, so many automatic listeners. And the feeling that no one is listening to me makes us want to spend time with machines that seem to care about us. We're developing robots, they call them sociable robots, that are specifically designed to be companions to the elderly, to our children, to us. Have we so lost confidence that we will be there for each other?
I don't think I would personally like to have, lying in hospital in a semi-comatose state, a robot coming along saying, "Are you feeling okay today?" Because that's what she goes on and talks about. That sort of thing's being developed right now. You want somebody that has empathy, that understands what you're going through, that connects with you in your pain and your suffering and your issues of life. That's what people need. So, yes, we have social media, we have the connection, we have this, but we need depth in relationship that meets the very cry of our heart for authentic community, authentic somebody who cares. So in education, we have this challenge, don't we? We have this challenge to be that to our students, to engage them in a very meaningful way. So this leads to our third discussion group, and we'll conclude with this. Break in again, have a think about it. So the normal part of our life, how can Christian education adapt appropriately to this reality? How do we, as educators, address loneliness within an isolated society? And then embracing technology produces results, but what are the consequences? What protective factors can be incorporated into our educational structures? You know, we didn't hear of anybody that had thought about some of these policies and procedures on campus, but I hopefully this will begin to fuel some thinking and fuel some discussion and begin to ask the questions, well, what do we do and how do we go forward? Break into discussion, have a think about it. The loneliness in the society, maybe even for you, different people in the room here will probably feel very lonely, really don't have a confidant that they can talk to and confide in about their issues. It's a major portion of spiritual formation. Right. So while we've got all this social media, we've got all these technology, we've got all these tools, let's use it. As we saw from the recap from the brain science, it stimulates brain growth, development, all that happens, but we need it holistically. It needs to keep relationally connected. As we heard from the last lady, we can't just sacrifice conversation for connection, as we saw, because we want relationship and loneliness to be dealt with. We might have a lot of connections, a lot of social media connections, but are they really meeting here? So that's all the challenges we face, and I wish you well. God bless you. Thank you for coming and sitting through this presentation.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.